B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Tuesday, January 29th, 2019. I'm sorry I was missing in action yesterday. The mountains called me, and I responded. Had a great day skiing at Lake Tahoe. Some of my Facebook friends may have caught the video of that. And I also survived, a hit-and-run collision. I was driving up US 50 through Echo Pass on Sunday evening when a car in the other direction, oncoming traffic, sideswiped me, and I feel fortunate because his or her front left bumper narrowly missed my front left bumper, and the contact was made just over the front wheel and along the driver's side. And the bummer was I pulled over. I was angry. And I saw that a car heading in the other direction also pulled over. And then apparently when they saw I had pulled over, they took off. And so I'm left to deal with a hit and run, uninsured damage of a couple of $1,000s. Not very happy about that, but that's how it goes some days. So we are in a fascinating situation because the U.S., our leadership of both parties, and the corporate media seem to be fully committed to endless war. And we're seeing some progress in the talks that we've been conducting with the Taliban, hoping to lead to a U.S. exit from Afghanistan after just 17 years. Oh, come on. By the time the talks are wrapped up, it'll be 18. And Zalmay Khalilzad, there's a K there on the front of his last name, who served both Bush and Obama and is now Trump's special envoy to try to find a way out of Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires, as it's called. He reports that there is progress after 6 days of talks in Qatar. Now, keep in mind, the Afghan government is not yet included in these talks, and the leader, Ashraf Ghani, warned against a precipitous troop withdrawal, insisted that any peace agreement must be Afghan-led. Well, that's nice, but we haven't paid any attention to these figurehead leaders of Afghanistan since we invaded, and I don't believe we're about to start now. So, what we have is a pledge from the Taliban that Afghanistan will not be used for attacks against other countries. Now, that may sound good on paper. I don't know exactly how you enforce an agreement like that. After all, the Taliban is this murky, chameleon-like entity that originally was a project of the CIA of Pakistan, the ISI. And who knows what it'll morph into in a post-U.S. occupation period. So I bring this to your attention because so many Americans have given up on Afghanistan. I refer to it as the whatever war. Obama surged. He surged troops twice. People yawned. He pulled out all but 14,000 troops. He didn't get any political bump for that. People yawned once again. And to argue that we must forever keep 14,000 American soldiers, including my nephew Liam, those boots on the ground in Afghanistan, is just so ludicrous. But here is the Gray Lady, the New York Times, in what's called news analysis, warning us that we cannot pull our troops out of Afghanistan. Will the departing Americans end up handing over the country to the same ruthless militants that the U.S. went to war to dislodge? Well, that purports that there was a rational basis for our original invasion of Afghanistan. And the Times warns that the deal, which includes the insurgents guaranteeing that Afghan territory is never used by terrorists, setting the stage for a total pullout by troops, and then they just quote one after another of the leaders about how risky this would be. Now, the current plan, even though Trump has tweeted that he wants our troops home tomorrow, is that those 14,000 troops will be there for at least another year and a half. And that is hardly a precipitous retreat. And meanwhile, the biggest irritant is that the U.S. keeps conducting bombing raids. We don't admit them. They rarely get reported in television news in this country. But just last week, 29 people were killed by 2 airstrikes. Most of the victims were women and children. This occurred in southern Helmand province. We've blown up their weddings. We've conducted night raids. We've just used and abused that country. And I'm hopeful that Khalilzad's efforts will produce some sort of a face-saving way for the U.S. to finally get out of Afghanistan. And nobody is learning any lessons from that, from Iraq, from Syria, from Libya, because the headlong rush to confront Venezuela and to conduct a regime change coup and to force Nicolas Maduro from power is gaining momentum on these shores. And nary a critical word is heard in the media. As I've pointed out, only 3 members of Congress so far have issued statements resisting the idea that the U.S. should be supporting this regime change scheme. And those were Bernie Sanders, Ro Khanna, congressman from Silicon Valley, and Tulsi Gabbard, the congresswoman from Hawaii who is running for president. All the others are running away from the question, or they are supporting Trump. And the talk from these shores is so ridiculous. All right, yesterday we issued new instructions, and this self-styled opposition leader, who the U.S. has recognized, and in a moment will explain that he has zero legitimacy. But we not only gave him control by freezing $7 billion in U.S. assets and blocking more than $11 billion in revenue that Venezuela would get from oil sales this coming year through its American subsidiary, Citgo. And today, Secretary of State Pompeo gave Guaido control over certain Venezuelan government accounts at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And then you have John Bolton, who appeared at a news conference carrying a yellow notepad with the handwritten words, 5,000 troops to Colombia. They're so secretive, aren't they? And what is amazing is that today, in response to the U.S. empowering of Juan Guaido, the chief prosecutor in Venezuela, asked the Supreme Court to block Guaido from leaving the country and to freeze his bank accounts, his personal accounts. Now that pales in comparison to what the U.S. has done. But John Bolton thundered, "We denounce the illegitimate former Venezuelan Attorney General's threats against President Juan Guaido. Let me reiterate, there'll be serious consequences for those who attempt to subvert democracy and harm Guaido." Now, the bullshit in that statement is so stinky and hot and wet, forgive me, but this really defies any rational analysis. And to see the so-called American resistance, the Democrats, silent or supportive? Now, the Venezuelan Attorney General is neither illegitimate nor former. Juan Guaido is not the president. And the idea that people who oppose Guaido would be subverting democracy? This guy wasn't even elected the leader of the National Assembly, which is the perch from which he claims to make himself the president by vacating Maduro's presidency. I mean, this does not pass a fundamental smell test, much less amount to any kind of democracy. And what I love, I hear this line repeated. I picked this up in an article from The Guardian. Maduro, the president sworn in earlier this month for a second term after disputed elections last year, accuses Guaido of staging U.S.-directed coup attempt against him. Now, first of all, the dispute about those elections has only been raised in the last couple of weeks. There was a boycott by the opposition. And Maduro was declared the winner with international observers present. In the next few days, I hope to get a fresh interview with Dan Kovalik, who was an election observer in Venezuela last year. But what's interesting is the U.S. media will repeat Maduro's claim that Guaido is staging a U.S.-directed coup. And that statement is made for the purpose of dismissing it for American audiences. I believe it happens to be true. And this is how our corporate media sells us a war. Over the Gray Zone Project, some great coverage coming from Max Blumenthal and Ben Horton. They publish a poll conducted last week, 2 weeks ago, over the last 2 weeks, January 7th to January 20th, asking Venezuelans, do you support the financial sanctions currently applied to remove President Maduro from power? 81% said no, 17% said yes, and only 2% aren't sure. Would you agree if there were an international intervention to remove President Maduro from power? 78% oppose it, 20% support it, and only 2% not sure. Would you agree or disagree if there were international military intervention in Venezuela to remove Maduro? 86% oppose, only 12% support that. But, really, who cares what the citizens of Venezuela think? Over at Consortium News, they publish a piece by Eva Goldinger, who is, I believe, a Venezuelan American. And she writes that Leopoldo Lopez, and by the way, I think in Friday's podcast I called him Lopez. It's Leopoldo Lopez and his wife Maria Corina Machado. They have long histories as collaborators, grantees, agents of Washington, the National Endowment for Democracy, and the U.S. Agency for International Development have channeled multi-million-dollar funding to Lopez political parties. The agencies have filtered more than $14 million to opposition groups in Venezuela between 2013 and 2014. May I remind you that that was Barack Obama's administration? Trump is merely picking up the baton. And in the period after we tried to take out Chavez in April of 2002, USAID and the NED injected more than $100 million into support for opposition groups and undermining the Chavez and Maduro governments. This is a long-running regime change operation, and that's why so many Democrats support it. And yes, it is about the oil. And I want to recommend this lengthy piece I printed out 25-plus pages by Max Blumenthal and his colleague, Dan Cohen, at the Gray Zone Project. And they take us through the entire history of Juan Guaido, an obscure character from a marginal far-right group. He has been involved in street violence, in silly efforts where they drop their drawers and moon their protest and opposition. And, as I mentioned, he was not elected. He simply was the next in line to be designated the leader of the National Assembly, which has been shut down by the Chavez government, and there is an issue there to be aired out. I don't support all of the authoritarian moves by Nicolas Maduro, and I think I may have just called him Chavez. But the idea that this enables the United States and others to determine the new leadership of Venezuela is stunning and unacceptable to me. So Guaido graduated from a Catholic university in Caracas. He moved to Washington, D.C., enrolled in the governance and political management program at George Washington University. And let's see, what else do we have on him here? Oh, a reference to Milton Friedman and the Chicago School, and be prepared for shock doctrine and the kind of vulture capitalism that Naomi Klein has written about. So Guaido, back in 2007, joined a group called Popular Will, led by Leopoldo Lopez. the Princeton-educated right-wing firebrand heavily involved in these U.S.-funded programs in Venezuela. It's also reported that Guaido and several other student activists attended a secret 5-day training at the Fiesta Mexicana Hotel in Mexico City. The sessions run by a group called Optor, a Belgrade-based regime change training group backed by the U.S. government. Yeah, we internationalize that outsourcing, don't we? So in 2014, Caracas released documents detailing an assassination plot against Maduro. The leaks identified the Miami-based Maria Corina Machado as a leader of the scheme. And Guaido was directly involved in efforts in 2014, the protests. He tweeted a video showing himself clad in a helmet and gas mask, and so he's been a part of this opposition for some time. He didn't just surface in recent weeks. He spent most of his 9-year career in the National Assembly as an alternate deputy, and he came in second place during the 2015 parliamentary elections, winning just 26% of the votes that were cast. He was never elected to the position as president of the opposition-dominated National Assembly. So this is important background information, and I hope you'll click on the link in my show file and follow it to Gray Zone Project to learn more. Also want to recommend a piece that's unsigned at Common Dreams that expresses outrage at the appointment of Elliot Abrams last week as special envoy to Venezuela. He is described here accurately as an unrepentant interventionist, notorious for being found guilty for his role in the Iran-Contra scandal. He guided U.S. policy toward supporting genocide in Guatemala under Reagan, the architect of the Panama invasion under Poppy Bush, central figure in the failed coup against Hugo Chavez in 2002 under Baby Bush. And the piece at Common Dreams outlines a diplomatic path that hasn't occurred, apparently, to our leaders in Washington, or at least not so far. Every day I pause for a moment to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Lyle Rubin, who was an interview guest last year, he took out a monthly subscription. Linear Bob Getzla is good for $5 a month, and he's been doing that for a while. Jerry in Southeast Portland, he kicks in $5 a month. And so does the real Siri Walgren, up in the northernmost reaches of California. I appreciate their support. I'd like to appreciate yours, so come on over and join me at peterbcollins.com. You click on the menu button, click on Become a Subscriber. You land on the sign-up page, and there you choose $5, $10, $20 a month. And if you don't like PayPal, I understand that. You can use the U.S. mail to communicate with me at P.O. Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, zip 94915. Well, I am a little surprised at the early and rosy coverage that my junior Senator Kamala Harris is getting for her entry into the presidential sweepstakes of 2020. And as I was driving back from the mountains last night, I listened to CNN's town hall meeting on my satellite radio. Couldn't see the visuals, obviously. But I have to say that Jake Tapper was just pitching softballs. And most of the questions came from students at, Drake University or wherever the event was held. And most of the questions were, pretty easy. There were a couple of tough ones from some of the students there. But I'm amazed at the way CNN wrote this up under the byline of Jill Filipovic, who is a staunch supporter of Hillary Clinton, or was. She wrote a book about the campaign. And the headline reads, "It's Kamala Harris's race right now." Well, come on. They immediately allow that there are going to be a lot of candidates, and it's very early. But Monday night, it solidified her standing as a leading contender. She was fluid and engaging, striking that always tough balance for women of being both authoritative and warm. She took solidly left positions. No, she didn't. She talked vaguely about supporting a Green New Deal, but didn't define it in any way, shape, or form. And she defines herself as a former progressive prosecutor, and the progressive part simply doesn't match her record, as we here in California well know. So it's interesting to see the Clinton machine clearly has a lot of love for Kamala Harris. Maybe it's not exclusive, but it's pretty powerful. She's recruited a lot of Clinton people to run her campaign, and she is running in a model that echoes many of Hillary Clinton's positions. She's also trying to tap into the Obama element of the electorate using her biracial background. She's got a Jamaican father and an Indian mother, or maybe it's the other way around. At any rate, she is a woman of color, and she's tapping into the alumni networks at her alma mater, Howard University, and also the black sorority Alpha Kappa Alpha. And the New York Times is reporting that she does have strong support initially from older black women. But left-leaning young black voters who were ultimately disenchanted by Obama's presidency may value political ideology more than racial solidarity. Well, it's obvious that she hopes to get strong support from the African American community. But she has to overcome many hurdles. One is her inexperience. I think some people may chit-chat about her early relationship with former San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown, who appointed her to some top jobs. He dated her, and he, of course, has had an open marriage, and it's not any secret in San Francisco. He is still married to his wife Blanche after 60 years or something like that, but he has squired young ladies of various descriptions without gaining much notice over the years. At any rate, Stephen Zunis, who is a professor at the University of San Francisco, has a piece at Foreign Policy in Focus that I recommend to you, because what he points out is that when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, she is more AIPAC than J Street. And here, one of her first moves after being elected and joining the Senate in January of 2017, she opposed President Obama's refusal to veto the UN Security Council resolution on Israeli settlements. Then she co-sponsored a resolution herself challenging the right of the UN to weigh in on questions of international humanitarian law in territories under foreign belligerent occupation, like Palestine. So this is a very thoughtful piece. And I don't have time to run through every element, but I do encourage you to check it out. Now, when it comes to boycott, divestment, and sanctions, she has accused those campaigns of anti-Semitism. And she claims that efforts in the UN to pressure the Netanyahu government to end its violations of international humanitarian law are actually designed to, quote, delegitimize Israel. Now, that's Zionist talk. And Harris was in Iowa on television last night, so she wasn't present for this ugly vote in the Senate where 25 Democrats went with the Republican majority to move forward on the legislation called Senate Bill 1. This includes the component of anti-boycott language, and it also has $38 billion in military funding for Israel over the next 10 years. Let's name names. Here are the senators who voted with the Republicans: Bennett of Colorado, Blumenthal of Connecticut, Cantwell of Washington, Cardin of Maryland, Casey of Pennsylvania, Coons of Delaware, Cortez Masto, Nevada, Duckworth of Illinois, Hassan of New Hampshire, Jones of Alabama, King of Maine, he's an independent, Klobuchar of Minnesota, Manchin of West Virginia, Markey of Massachusetts, Menendez of New Jersey, Murray of Washington, Rosen of Nevada, Schumer of New York, Sinema of Arizona, Smith of Minnesota, Stabenow of Michigan, Tester of Montana, Warner of Virginia, Whitehouse of Rhode Island, and Wyden of Oregon. Bernie Sanders gets some credit for voting against this piece of shit, but he had to separate himself from BDS. While I do not support the BDS movement, we must defend every American's constitutional right to peacefully engage in political activity. It's clear to me that Senate Bill 1 would violate Americans' First Amendment rights. Well, he's correct. But he could be even more righteous if he opposed the bill because he supports BDS. And I want to cite some language from David Glick. He's a neighbor of mine here in Marin County, and our local paper published his letter responding to a critic of Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. And Glick writes that the person he's responding to views Tlaib's support for BDS as anti-Semitic. Let me remind him that boycotts have a noble history going back to the Montgomery boycott, and let's not forget the Tea Party. And David Glick, by the way, is Jewish. He goes on to say, it is a dangerous mistake to equate any and all criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic precisely because there is real and vicious anti-Semitism in this world. And if we dilute its meaning, we will not have it to fight the real villain when we need it. And get this, as if the Democratic Party is not overboard in support of Israel already, several prominent veteran Democrats, led by pollster Mark Mellman, have formed the Democratic Majority for Israel. Mellman says, most Democrats are strongly pro-Israel. We want to keep it that way. There are a few discordant voices, but we want to make sure that's a very small problem, and it doesn't metastasize into a bigger problem. Listen to that language. Support for the Palestinians, opposition to apartheid, is a problem that they want to prevent from metastasizing into a bigger problem. They've recruited former Michigan Governor Jennifer Granholm. She's pretty tight with the Clintons. Former Clinton Housing Secretary Henry Cisneros. And by the way, a new poll by Pew shows that the share of liberal Democrats who sympathized more with Israel than Palestinians has dropped from 33 to 19% in just 3 years. So younger Democrats have a much more, I think, healthy view of these issues. The Pew poll indicated that while 56% of voters over 65 sympathize more with Israel than the Palestinians, only 32% of the people under 30 feel the same way. And that is encouraging. Meanwhile, the government of the Palestinian Authority has tendered its resignation to the President Mahmoud Abbas. Now, this could signal a major transition. Abbas is elderly and described as ill, and I think he's certainly past his prime. The departing Prime Minister, Rami Hamdallah, former university president, has led what was largely a technocratic administration, and it's unclear what the Fatah leadership will do. While we're in the Middle East, I was listening, as I often do, to Rush Limbaugh's right-wing rant as I drove to the secret studio this morning. And my ears perked up as he said, the Times of Israel is reporting that scientists in Israel have developed a cure for cancer. Now, the report is true. I printed it out from the Times of Israel. A small team of Israeli scientists think they might have found the first complete cure for cancer. According to one of the scientists, our cancer cure will be effective from day one, will last a duration of a few weeks, will have no or minimal side effects at a much lower cost than most other treatments on the market. Our solution will be both generic and personal. Now, this sounds very promising, and it's not the point of my story. I say mazel tov to the scientists, and if anybody can cure cancer, I am all for it. But then Limbaugh went on to say that this wouldn't have happened if Trump had stayed in the Iran deal. And I said, what? What? What the hell are you talking about? And he said, yeah, because those scientists would have been reduced to ashes. Really? Now, we know that under the Obama-led negotiation that involved 6 countries and Iran, that Iran had given up any intention of enriching uranium to weapon levels, and we know from Gareth Porter's reporting that they never had an intentional program to develop a nuclear weapon, at least not since 2002. So today, the top spooks went to Capitol Hill. Gina Haspel of the CIA, FBI Director Chris Wray, and Dan Coates, the Director of National Intelligence. And the intel bosses had several comments that don't jibe with Donald Trump's worldview. One is that North Korea, according to Coates, is unlikely to completely give up its nuclear weapons and production capabilities, which the country's leaders consider critical to their survival. But they also said that the government of Iran is not trying to build a nuclear weapon, despite the Trump administration's persistent claims that the country has been violating the terms of the international agreement forged under Obama and John Kerry. Officials told lawmakers Iran is in compliance with the agreement. No mention there of the cure for cancer. Oh, also in the Intel assessment, they ranked the problems at the southern border. Well, it comes on page 18 of a 42-page report. So they don't share the crisis mentality that the president promotes. Meanwhile, Theresa May is acting like a groundhog. She is now saying she's going back to Brussels and demand that the European Union reopen the Brexit exit deal that she negotiated. Good luck with that, Theresa. Good luck. Yesterday, in a very nervous exchange with the media, Acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker, who was there to primarily talk about the indictments against the Chinese technology firm, he was asked about the status of the Mueller probe. Quote, I have been fully briefed on the investigation. I look forward to Director Mueller delivering the final report. I'm comfortable that the decisions that were made are going to be reviewed. Right now, the investigation is, I think, close to being completed. Now, is this wishful thinking? Or is that an accurate assessment? Of course, we never hear from Mueller, so we can't tell. But I find that far-fetched. We'll just have to wait and see. And the guy who is supposed to take over for the acting AG Whitaker has had his confirmation vote delayed by another week. Bill Barr returned written statements in response to senators' questions, and they're not happy with his narrative of what he will do with the Mueller report when it is submitted. And I share the concerns about that. Even Lindsey Graham, who's now chairing the House Judiciary Committee, he agreed with Sheldon Whitehouse that, if Barr decided to follow the legal guidance that a sitting president couldn't be indicted, that he could just eliminate Trump from the report entirely. And that wouldn't satisfy too many people. Finally today, Howard Schultz, the former Starbucks chief executive, has announced he wants to run for president as a billionaire centrist independent. And even Mike Bloomberg, who has thought about spending some of his billions to run as an independent, knows that you cannot win that way. And he says it would just split the anti-Trump vote and end up re-electing the president. So, Mr. Schultz, I suggest you go back to the coffee business. I don't drink coffee. I don't hang out at Starbucks. It's kind of a combination of America's living room and America's bathroom. Why don't you make sure the music is on and clean the restrooms, okay? Don't run for president, please. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You'll find it on YouTube, and I'm still Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.